The rain came down in sheets against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 58th floor, turning Manhattan into a blur of gold and white streaks that looked almost impressionistic if you squinted hard enough. Vivian Aldridge stood 3 feet from the edge of Julian Harrington's Italian marble desk, her hands resting on the swell of her belly 7 months along, though the cheap maternity cardigan she'd bought at a Goodwill store made it hard to tell if you weren't looking closely. The fabric had been washed so many times it was nearly translucent at the elbows, and the hem hung unevenly because she'd tried to fix a snag herself with a needle and thread from a dollar store sewing kit. Julian sat behind the desk in a chair that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His fingers wrapped around a crystal tumbler of Macallan 30. The scotch caught the light from the rain-streaked windows and threw amber reflections across his face as he swirled the liquid slowly, deliberately, like a man savoring the moment before delivering a final blow. He hadn't looked up when she'd entered. He'd made her stand there pregnant and exhausted for a full 30 seconds before acknowledging her presence with a single word that landed like a stone dropped into still water. Papers. That was all he'd said. One word. Not her name. Not a greeting. Just papers flat and cold as if she were a courier delivering documents instead of his wife of 6 years standing in his office to sign away everything they'd built together. Except they hadn't built anything together. That was the lie Vivian had been living with for so long it had started to feel like truth, until this exact moment when the scales finally fell away and she saw him clearly for the first time since the day she'd met him in a Brooklyn coffee shop, and decided to test whether one man in this world could love her for who she was instead of what she owned. The papers sat on the credenza to her left, stacked neatly next to a bottle of mineral water and a Mont Blanc pen that probably cost more than the used Honda Civic she'd been driving for the past 3 years. Julian had already signed. She could see his signature slashed across the bottom of the top page, aggressive and oversized, the kind of signature that announced its importance to anyone who happened to glance at it. All she had to do was add her own name next to his and walk out of his life forever. Vivian Gray would disappear. The kindergarten teacher who lived in a 5th-floor walk-up in the Bronx and clipped coupons from the Sunday paper would cease to exist. And the woman who had scrubbed his dishes and ironed his shirts and held his hand through panic attacks before his bar exam would become nothing more than a footnote in the biography of Julian Harrington, rising star of fintech, the man whose face had appeared on the cover of 3 major financial magazines in the past month alone. She picked up the pen. Her hand didn't shake. That surprised her. She'd thought it would shake, had imagined this moment 1,000 times over the past 3 weeks since he'd first told her he wanted a divorce, and in every version she'd played out in her mind, her hand had trembled so badly she could barely hold the pen. But now, standing here with the actual document in front of her, and the rain hammering against the windows, and Julian taking another slow sip of scotch behind her, her hand was perfectly steady. "Can we at least talk about this?" She didn't phrase it as a question. Her voice came out flat, resigned, the tone of someone who already knows the answer but feels obligated to ask anyway because that's what decent people do when their marriages are ending. They talk, they try. They don't just sign papers and walk away without at least attempting to salvage something from the wreckage. Julian stood up from his chair. The leather creaked softly as he pushed it back, and Vivian heard his footsteps crossing the space between them. Expensive Italian shoes on imported hardwood, each step a small declaration of the distance that had opened up between the man she'd married and the man he'd become. When he stopped moving, he was close enough that she could smell the scotch on his breath, and the cologne he'd started wearing 6 months ago, something sharp and woodsy that cost $200 an ounce, and that Scarlett had probably picked out for him during one of their lunch meetings that everyone at the office knew about, except apparently Julian thought Vivian didn't. His eyes moved to her belly, not with tenderness, not with concern, with something that looked almost like disgust, as if the physical evidence of what they'd created together offended him on some fundamental level. "That baby is your anchor, not mine." The words came out conversational, almost friendly, the way you might tell someone they had spinach in their teeth or their coat was inside out. Matter of fact, no heat in it, no emotion at all. "I told you not to get pregnant. You did it on purpose to trap me into staying. Well, congratulations. It didn't work." He walked past her to the minibar set into the wall of bookshelves. Books he'd never read, leather-bound editions of classics he'd bought by the yard from an interior designer who specialized in making rich people look educated. The ice clinked as he refilled his glass, and Vivian watched his reflection in the window superimposed over the rain-blurred cityscape like a ghost haunting the life she'd thought they were building. "My lawyer says I can contest paternity after it's born. Scarlett thinks it might not even be mine." The name landed between them like a grenade with the pin pulled. Scarlett Vaughn. 29 years old, vice president of marketing, long red hair and legs that went on for days, and a smile that looked warm until you noticed it never quite reached her eyes. Vivian had met her exactly twice, once at the company Christmas party 2 years ago, and once at a fundraiser last spring where Scarlett had worn a dress cut down to her navel and spent the entire evening touching Julian's arm while laughing at jokes that weren't funny. "You know this baby is yours, Julian." Vivian said it quietly without heat, because what was the point of getting angry at a man who'd already decided the truth didn't matter? She placed one hand on her belly and felt the baby kick a sharp thump against her palm that seemed to say, "I'm here. I'm real. I exist, regardless of whether he chooses to acknowledge me." Julian took a long sip of his scotch and let the burn settle in his chest before he spoke again. When he did, his voice carried the particular brand of cruelty that comes from someone who's convinced himself he's actually doing you a favor by being honest. "Sign the papers, Vivian. Go back to whatever it is you do all day. Clipping coupons, knitting socks, watching those reality shows you love so much." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass and watched the light play through it, a small private moment of appreciation for his own taste and refinement. "I need a wife who fits the life I'm building. The Webb Capital merger closes next month. Do you know what that means?" He didn't wait for her to answer. "It means galas in Monaco. It means dinners with senators. I cannot have a wife who looks like she shops by the pound at Goodwill standing next to me at a black tie event. It's bad for the brand." He set his glass down on the marble sidebar with a soft clink that sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet office. The rain had intensified, drumming against the windows in a rhythm that felt almost accusatory, as if the weather itself was bearing witness to this moment and finding it wanting. "You're invisible, Vivian. You've always been invisible." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment Vivian actually felt herself disappearing, felt her edges blurring and her substance draining away, until she was nothing but a translucent outline of a woman standing in an expensive office wearing a threadbare cardigan and carrying a baby that its own father didn't want to claim. She searched his face for any trace of the man she'd married 6 years ago. The man who'd been hungry and ambitious, yes, but who'd also been kind. The man who'd proposed to her in a rainstorm outside a diner in Brooklyn because he couldn't afford a restaurant. The man who'd cried when she told him she was proud of him the day he passed the bar exam. That man was gone. In his place stood a stranger wearing a bespoke suit and an ugly smile, and Vivian realized with a clarity that felt almost physical that she'd been mourning the loss of someone who'd probably never existed in the first place. "You're right, Julian. I don't fit in your world." She heard her own voice as if from a great distance, calm, and measured the voice of a woman who'd already done her grieving in private and was now simply attending the funeral of her marriage. "Finally." He muttered it under his breath, but she heard it anyway. "Finally." As if her capitulation was the last box he needed to check before he could move on to the next chapter of his carefully curated life. Vivian uncapped the pen. For a moment she hesitated, not out of love or hope, but out of a final ethical pause, a last chance for the universe to intervene and turn this moment into something other than what it was. The universe declined the invitation. The rain kept falling. Julian kept standing by his minibar with his scotch and his self-satisfaction, and Vivian signed her name on the line next to his Vivian Gray. The scratch of the pen against paper echoed through the silent office like a door closing forever. She placed the pen down gently, precisely aligned with the edge of the document, and stepped back from the credenza. "It's done." Julian strode over and snatched the papers up, checking her signature carefully as if he expected her to have somehow tricked him even in this final moment. When he was satisfied that everything was in order, he smiled. It was the wide, self-satisfied smile of a man who believes he's just won the game of his life, who thinks he's outsmarted everyone in the room and come out on top through sheer force of will and superior intelligence. Perfect. My lawyer will wire the settlement funds to your account within 48 hours. Try not to spend it all on diapers and cat food. He turned his back on her and walked to the window, looking out at the city. He felt he owned the rain-slicked streets and glittering towers that represented everything he'd worked for and everything he believed he deserved. The rain had lightened slightly, and the skyline sparkled like a promise meant only for him. You can leave your key on the desk on your way out. And Vivian, he paused, letting her name hang in the air for a moment. Don't come back. Security downstairs has been updated. You won't be on the list. Vivian walked to the marble desk. She placed her house key down with a soft clink that seemed to echo the sound of the pen hitting the credenza just moments before. She looked at the back of his head one last time, at the perfect haircut that cost $300 every 2 weeks, and the shoulders that had grown broader from the personal trainer he'd hired when Scarlett suggested he needed to work on his physique. Goodbye, Julian. I hope the view is worth it. She turned and walked out of the office. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her with a sound that was quiet and final, like the last page of a book being closed by someone who has no intention of ever reading it again. Behind her in the office, she would never see again. Julian Harrington raised his glass to his reflection in the rain-streaked window and spoke to the only person in the world whose opinion he truly valued. To freedom. To upgrading. He took a long, satisfied sip and let the burn spread through his chest like warmth, like vindication, like proof that he'd made the right choice. He was already thinking about the penthouse he'd share with Scarlett, about the Webb Capital merger, and the media interviews that would follow about the galas and the private jets and the life he'd always deserved but had been too weighed down to reach while he was dragging Vivian's invisible weight behind him. He had no idea that the settlement he was so proud of, the one he considered generous given the circumstances, was less than the interest Vivian's family earned in a single hour. He didn't know that the woman who'd just walked out of his office wearing a stretched cardigan and carrying a canvas tote bag was the sole heir to a dynasty worth $3.1 trillion. He didn't know that she owned the bank that held his mortgage, that she controlled the software infrastructure that powered half the trading platforms on Wall Street, that her family's shipping empire moved more cargo across the Atlantic than any other private entity in the Western Hemisphere. He didn't know that by signing those papers, by mocking her as she left, by toasting himself in the reflection of a window he could barely afford, he had just made the most expensive mistake in the history of American finance. But he was about to find out. Vivian walked out of Harrington Tower and into the rain. She didn't open an umbrella because she didn't have one. She'd left it in the apartment that was no longer hers, in the closet of a life that had just been erased with a signature and a smirk. She simply stepped through the revolving door and let the cold November rain hit her face, her hair, her swollen belly, all of it, as if the water could wash away 6 years of pretending to be less than she was. She stood on the curb on Madison Avenue while the city rushed past her in a river of yellow cabs and black town cars and delivery trucks that hissed and honked and filled the air with exhaust and noise. A taxi swerved close to the curb and sent a wave of dirty water splashing across her jeans. She didn't flinch. She just stood there with both hands on her belly and felt the baby kick again, harder this time, more insistent, as if her daughter was trying to tell her something important. "It's just us now, little one." Vivian whispered it into the rain, into the noise of the city, into the November cold that was seeping through her thin cardigan. "But I promise you something. You will never, not for one single day of your life, feel unwanted. Do you hear me? You are wanted. You are loved. And your mama is going to make sure the world knows it." The tears came then. Not the polite, contained tears she'd trained herself to produce in front of Julian, the kind that made her look weak enough to satisfy his ego without actually inconveniencing him. These were real tears, deep tears, the tears of a woman who had spent 6 years hiding who she was, so that a man might love her for herself, only to discover that the man had never loved her at all. He had loved the idea of having someone beneath him, someone to look down on, someone to make him feel tall. She sobbed on the sidewalk while hundreds of people walked past. Businessmen in expensive suits, women in designer coats, teenagers with headphones, delivery guys pushing carts. Not one of them stopped. Not one of them even slowed down. She was invisible here too, just like Julian had said, a pregnant woman crying in the rain on one of the busiest streets in Manhattan, and the city flowed around her like water around a stone. Her phone rang. The cracked screen lit up with a name that made her close her eyes in relief. Dorothy Monroe. 57 years old, former college professor turned bakery owner, a woman built from Brooklyn steel and buttercream frosting, who had exactly zero tolerance for nonsense and an infinite capacity for love. She was the only person in New York City who knew the truth about Vivian Gray. Not the kindergarten teacher truth, the real truth. Vivian answered with a shaking hand. Honey, Dorothy's voice came through warm and fierce. Did he do it? Did that sorry excuse of a man actually go through with it? Vivian could barely speak through the tears. He said the baby might not be his Dorothy. He said I trapped him. He called our baby an anchor. The silence on the other end of the line lasted exactly 2 seconds. When Dorothy spoke again, her voice had dropped to the register she reserved for moments of absolute moral clarity. Lord have mercy on his soul, because I will not. You listen to me, Vivian Gray. You are not what that man says you are. You spent 6 years wearing thrift store sweaters and driving a Honda Civic so you could find out if one man on this earth could love you without a price tag. That's not weakness, honey. That's the bravest thing I've ever seen a woman do. And it's over now. It's time to stop hiding. I'm scared, Dorothy. The rain ran down Vivian's face, mixing with her tears until she couldn't tell which was which, not of being alone. I'm scared of who I become if I use what I have. Then don't use it for revenge. Use it for justice. Use it for that little girl in your belly. She deserves a mama who stands tall. She deserves to grow up knowing that her mother didn't crumble when the world tried to crush her. You hear me? I hear you? Good. Now, where are you? Are you still standing in the rain like a fool? I'm on the curb outside his building. Well, get off that curb. You're going to catch pneumonia, and I'm going to have to come down there and drag your billion-dollar behind into a warm car myself. Despite everything, Vivian almost smiled. Almost. And then the car arrived. It didn't pull up the way a taxi pulls up with squealing brakes and a honking horn. It glided to the curb like a ship docking in a harbor, silent and immense and inevitable. A Rolls-Royce Phantom in midnight blue, so deep it looked black, with windows tinted to the point of opacity and diplomatic flags on the fender that made other cars give it a wide berth as it eased into the space where Vivian stood. In the financial district of Manhattan, luxury cars were common, but a Phantom of this caliber, with an aura of old-world power that seemed to bend the light around it, was something else entirely. Pedestrians stopped on the sidewalk and stared. A woman in a business suit actually lowered her umbrella to get a better look. The rear door opened from the inside. A man stepped out. Early 60s, tall, with a military posture so rigid it looked like his spine had been replaced with a steel rod. He wore a suit that cost more than Julian's entire office fit out, though you would never know it because the man wearing it didn't care about fashion. He cared about precision. His face was grave but kind, the face of a man who had spent decades protecting someone he considered family. He held a large black umbrella. He opened it and stepped forward, shielding Vivian completely from the rain before a single additional drop could touch her. Miss Aldridge. He began with her real name, then corrected himself with immediate precision. Miss Gray. My apologies. Old habits. Vivian looked at him. The tears were still wet on her cheeks, but something in her eyes shifted when she saw him. The despair didn't vanish, but it moved aside to make room for something else. Recognition, relief, and the faintest beginning of resolve. Hello, Theodore. You're right on time. Theodore Blackwell, 62 years old, head of private security and legal counsel for the Aldridge Legacy Trust. Former military intelligence, 23 years of service to the Aldridge family. He had watched Vivian grow up. He had taught her to ride a bicycle on the grounds of the family estate in Newport when she was 6. He had stood at the back of the church at her wedding to Julian and said nothing, though his silence that day had been louder than a scream. He held the umbrella over her with the steady hand of a man who would stand in a hurricane if she asked him to. The board has been notified of the signature. The trust is fully unlocked. Your grandmother was notified 7 minutes ago. She sends her love and asked me to tell you, and I quote, "It's about damn time." Grandmother is always dramatic. Vivian said it with a warmth that cracked through her grief like sunlight through storm clouds. She stepped into the car. The interior hit her with a wave of warmth that she felt in her bones. The scent of jasmine and aged wood surrounded her. The leather seats were softer than anything in the apartment she'd shared with Julian, which she supposed was ironic given that this car cost more than the entire apartment building. Theodore closed her door, walked around to the front passenger seat, and settled in beside the driver with the efficiency of a man who had performed this routine 1,000 times. As the car pulled away from the curb and merged silently into traffic, Theodore turned to face her through the partition. "We have taken the liberty of retrieving your personal items from the residence in the Bronx. They are being transported to the penthouse at the St. Regis as we speak. Is there anything else you require from your former life?" Vivian watched Harrington Tower shrink in the rain-streaked window. 58 floors of glass and ambition, a monument to Julian's ego. She felt nothing. No longing, no regret, just the strange hollow lightness of finally setting down a weight she'd been carrying for 6 years. No Theodore? Nothing. Theodore nodded. Then his tone shifted, dropping an octave into the register he used for operational briefings. "Regarding Mr. Harrington, we completed the financial audit you requested 6 months ago. The results are comprehensive and I must say deeply unflattering." He paused, letting the weight of the next word settle properly. "He is insolvent, Miss Gray. Completely insolvent. He has been embezzling from the Harrington Digital Ventures Employee Pension Fund to cover the lease payments on his Ferrari and the renovation of his office. He has hidden over $19 million in losses inside shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. He has 3 offshore accounts he has not declared to the Internal Revenue Service. He is borrowing from one creditor to pay another, and he genuinely believes that the merger with Webb Capital will save him from all of it." Vivian closed her eyes. She rested her hands on her belly and felt the baby kick again, stronger this time, more insistent. He stole from his own employees, from their retirement. "Yes, Miss Gray, 81 individuals. Some of them are within 2 years of retirement age. They have no idea their pensions have been gutted." Vivian was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was different. The grief was still there, but it had been joined by something harder, something with edges. "Theodore, before we do anything else, I want those employees protected. I want every dollar restored to the pension fund quietly. No press, no credit. They should never know it was at risk." "Already in motion, Miss Gray. Your grandmother authorized the transfer this morning. The funds will be restored by end of business tomorrow." Vivian opened her eyes. Theodore saw them clearly in the rearview mirror and noted with the professional detachment of a man who has served this family for over 2 decades that they were no longer the soft, passive eyes Julian Harrington was accustomed to seeing. They were clear, cold, brilliant. The eyes of a woman who had been trained since birth to manage a dynasty worth $3.1 trillion and who had simply been choosing not to. "Take me to the penthouse. I need to make some calls." "And Theodore." "Yes, Miss Gray." "Nobody at Harrington Digital Ventures learns who is behind Vanguard Holdings. Not yet. Not until I'm ready. I want Julian to feel the walls closing in without having any idea who's building them." Theodore allowed himself the smallest of smiles. It was the smile of a chess master who has just been told to set up the board. "Understood, Miss Gray." Complete operational silence. The Rolls-Royce glided through the Manhattan traffic like a shark through dark water. Behind the tinted windows, Vivian pulled a phone from her tote bag. It wasn't the cracked smartphone she carried around Julian. It was a secure satellite device with no brand markings encrypted to military specifications. She dialed a single number. "It's done." Her voice was steady now. The tears were gone. In their place was the voice of a woman who had just stopped pretending. "Initiate the acquisition of Harrington Digital Ventures through Vanguard Holdings. Full audit, full restructuring plan, and tell the board I'm coming home." She ended the call and looked out the window at the city lights blurring past. Somewhere up there on the 58th floor of a building she could buy with her pocket change. Julian Harrington was pouring himself another scotch and toasting his own reflection. He thought he had just freed himself from a burden. He had no idea he had just released a storm. 3 weeks later, Julian Harrington felt like a god. The divorce had been finalized with record speed, thanks to what his lawyers called the most cooperative opposing party they had ever encountered. Vivian had not contested a single line of the settlement. She had taken the apartment in the Bronx, the Honda Civic, and a lump sum that Julian considered generous, but that would not have covered the fuel bill for Vivian's family jet for a single month. She had signed everything, taken everything, and vanished so completely that Julian sometimes wondered if she had ever existed at all. Good riddance, he told himself every morning while knotting his tie in the mirror. Dead weight. Anchor. Gone. Scarlett Vaughn had moved into the penthouse suite at the Ritz-Carlton within days of the divorce being finalized. She had redecorated it in shades of white and gold, which she said projected power and sophistication. Julian paid for all of it on credit, which he planned to pay off with the Webb Capital merger bonus. The numbers were astronomical. $920 million for the combined entity with an $18 million signing bonus just for him, plus stock options that could push him into the hundreds of millions once the company went public. He was on the cover of Forbes, The Wall Street Journal, and Bloomberg Businessweek within the same month. The headlines all said variations of the same thing: rising star of fintech. The man revolutionizing mobile banking. Julian Harrington, the future of digital finance. He had given interviews where he talked about disruption and innovation and the importance of staying hungry. He had been invited to speak at a tech conference in Silicon Valley. The world was bending toward him like a flower following the sun, and he was soaking up every ray. On this particular evening, 3 weeks after the divorce, Julian sat in the private dining room of Le Bernardin, with Scarlett glowing under the candlelight across from him. She wore a red dress that left strategic amounts to the imagination diamond earrings that caught every flicker of flame, $95,000 purchased on the company card under marketing expenses, and an expression of satisfied hunger that Julian mistook for love, but that was actually something much colder. To us. Scarlett raised her champagne flute, a vintage that cost $400 a bottle. And to the Webb deal. I heard the signing bonus alone is going to be 8 figures. Low 8 figures. Julian corrected with a modesty so false it practically winked. But the real money is in the stock options. Once we go public, we're talking hundreds of millions. We'll be royalty, Scarlett. Actual American royalty. Scarlett clinked her glass against his, and the crystal rang out clear and pure in the intimate space. I've already been looking at summer homes in the Hamptons, and maybe a chalet in Aspen for the winter. Oh, and Julian, we absolutely need to get on the list for the Met Gala next year. I will not take no for an answer. Consider it done. Julian cut into his lobster with the confidence of a man who believes he will never eat anything less expensive for the rest of his life. Scarlett took a sip of champagne and smiled, but it was not the warm, giddy smile of a woman in love. It was the smile of a woman reviewing her investment portfolio and finding the returns satisfactory. Because here is what Julian did not understand about Scarlett Vaughn, and what needed to be understood right now: Scarlett was not a mistress. She was an architect. She had identified Julian Harrington 18 months ago as a perfect target, a man with a growing company, a fragile ego, and a wife who would be easy to displace. She had studied Vivian for months before making her move, cataloging every vulnerability, every insecurity, every pressure point. She knew that Vivian was quiet. She knew that Vivian would not fight. She knew that if Julian was given the right words at the right time, he would drive Vivian out without Scarlett ever having to get her hands dirty. And she had given him every word. The anchor line, the invisible line, the goodwill line, every cruel phrase Julian had spoken during the divorce, every cutting remark that had made Vivian flinch, had been written by Scarlett Vaughn and rehearsed over pillow talk until Julian delivered them as naturally as if they were his own thoughts. Now, watching him preen over his lobster, Scarlett allowed herself a moment of private satisfaction. "I told you, babe, get rid of her before the 3rd trimester." After the baby comes, courts get sympathetic. Pregnant women get everything. Judges love a crying mother. We needed her gone fast, broken, and in tears, so she wouldn't have the energy to fight the settlement. You were right. Julian speared an asparagus tip. She just signed. Didn't even argue. Didn't bring a lawyer. Didn't ask for more money. She just signed and left. Easiest divorce in the history of matrimonial law. Scarlett shrugged, but her eyes were sharp. Of course she didn't argue. I gave you the script, Julian. I studied that woman for months. I knew exactly where to cut. Women like her, the quiet ones, the ones who hide behind kindness and cardigan sweaters, they don't fight. They fold. You just have to hit the right nerve. Julian raised his glass. Well, here's to your script. It worked perfectly. They clinked again. The champagne was going down easy, smoothing all the rough edges, making everything feel inevitable and right. I almost forgot to mention. Julian set down his fork. I'm meeting with a new investor group tomorrow morning, Vanguard Holdings. They appeared out of nowhere. Based in Delaware with operations in Singapore. Very exclusive, very private. They want to inject capital into the post-merger entity. My broker says they've been watching my career for years. They think I'm a visionary. Vanguard Holdings. Scarlett frowned slightly. I haven't heard of them. That's because they don't advertise Babe. This is private equity at the highest level. They don't come to you unless you're exceptional. They found me, not the other way around. Scarlett filed the name away in her mind but said nothing more. She had learned early in life that the best way to control a man was to let him believe every good idea was his own. Julian's phone buzzed on the white tablecloth. An unknown number. He glanced at Scarlett. Ignore it. It might be the web team. Julian picked up the phone. Harrington here. A voice came through the speaker. It was male, deep, and distorted slightly as if the connection were poor or the caller was using some kind of digital masking. Mr. Harrington, this is regarding your meeting with Vanguard Holdings tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Yes, I'm confirmed. Who is this? This is a courtesy call. The CEO of Vanguard will be attending the meeting personally. She rarely attends preliminary meetings. You should consider this significant. Be prepared. Julian felt a jolt of electricity run through him. The CEO was coming in person for a preliminary meeting. That meant they were serious. That meant big money. Potentially enormous money. The CEO. That's fantastic. What is her name? I'll have my team run a background brief. There was a pause on the other end, a silence that felt heavier than it should have. The CEO is not a he, Mr. Harrington, and she does not require a brief. She knows everything about you. Another pause, longer this time. Just bring your A-game. And Mr. Harrington, one more thing. Yes, wear the blue tie, the one you wore to your wedding. She likes nostalgia. The line went dead. Julian stared at the phone for a long moment, his brow furrowed. Then he laughed, shook his head, and set the phone down. Weird. What Scarlett was reapplying her lipstick in a compact mirror. The investor. The CEO is coming personally. A woman. And she gave me fashion advice. Told me to wear my wedding tie. Scarlett raised an eyebrow. Eccentric billionaires. They all love their little power plays. Who cares? As long as the check clears. Julian nodded and returned to his lobster. He did not wear the blue tie the next morning. He chose a red power tie instead. Nobody was going to dictate his wardrobe. He was Julian Harrington. He made the rules. He had no idea that the woman on the other end of that phone call knew more about his finances than he did. She knew about the Cayman Islands. She knew about the pension fund. She knew about the Ferrari lease and the inflated revenue projections and the fact that without the Webb Capital merger his company would be bankrupt within 90 days. She knew all of this because she owned the company that had audited every line. And she was his wife. His ex-wife, rather. The one in the cheap sweater. The one who clipped coupons. The invisible one. The one who was worth $3.1 trillion. The morning of the meeting, Julian arrived at the Four Seasons Hotel on 57th Street, feeling like he owned the world. The conference room was impressive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, a mahogany table that could seat 20 fresh flowers on the sideboard, and the kind of hushed, carpeted silence that whispers important things happen here. The room was empty except for a single man standing by the window with his hands clasped behind his back. Theodore Blackwell turned to face him. He was not wearing the dark suit he had worn at the curb outside Harrington Tower 3 weeks ago. Today he wore a charcoal three-piece suit with a pocket watch chain and cufflinks that were older than Julian's entire career. He looked like he had stepped out of a portrait hanging in a gentleman's club that Julian would never be invited to join. Julian did not recognize him. He had never seen Theodore before. The day Vivian left the building, Julian had been 58 floors up, toasting his reflection. He had not looked down at the curb. "Mr. Harrington, please have a seat. I am here representing Vanguard Holdings. My name is Theodore Blackwell. I'm here to see the CEO. Julian checked his watch with performative impatience. "I'm a busy man. The CEO sends her regrets. Her jet from the West Coast encountered headwinds. I am the authorized liaison for this meeting." Julian sat down with a huff. "Fine. Let's talk numbers. I'm looking for a $200 million injection for a 10% equity stake. Non-negotiable." Theodore smiled. It was the kind of smile that a shark might give a seal just before the water turns red. "We are prepared to offer $220 million. Julian's eyes went wide. "For what percentage?" 51%. Julian laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the laugh of a man who thinks he has just heard a joke. "You're joking. I am not selling my company. This is a partnership, not a takeover. It is not a takeover, Mr. Harrington." Theodore reached beneath the table and produced a thick file. He slid it across the polished mahogany with a single, smooth motion. "It is a rescue." Julian opened the file. The smile on his face died so quickly, it was as if someone had reached into his skull and switched off the light behind his eyes. Inside the file were photocopies of his private financial ledgers, the ones he kept in a locked drawer in his home office, the ones that showed the real numbers, not the ones he presented to Webb Capital or the board. The hidden debts, the creative accounting, the shell companies in the Cayman Islands, the embezzled pension fund, the offshore accounts he had never declared to the IRS. Everything, every lie, every theft, every fraud documented with the kind of forensic precision that suggested whoever had compiled this file had access to resources that Julian could not even imagine. "Where did you get these?" His voice came out as a hiss, all the confidence draining out of him like air from a punctured tire. "Vanguard Holdings is very thorough." Theodore folded his hands on the table with the patience of a man who has all the time in the world and knows it. "We know you are insolvent, Mr. Harrington, completely and irreversibly insolvent. If the Webb Capital Group sees this file, the merger is dead. If the SEC sees this file, you will be investigated for fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. If the FBI sees this file, you will go to prison. The question is not whether your world ends. The question is whether it ends with a whimper or a bang." Julian felt sweat trickling down his spine, soaking into his custom-made shirt. "Who are you people? We are the only thing standing between you and a federal indictment." Theodore spoke with the calm certainty of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. "The terms are straightforward. Vanguard Holdings acquires 51% of Harrington Digital Ventures. We inject $220 million in new capital. We clean up the books, pay down the debts, restore the pension fund, and make the Webb merger viable. You stay on as the public face of the company. You keep your title. You keep your office. But you answer to the CEO of Vanguard Holdings, and every major decision requires her approval." Julian stared at the file. His mind was racing, spinning through options like a rat in a maze looking for any exit that did not lead to a dead end. "Who is the CEO? I want to meet her. I'm not signing anything until I know who I'm dealing with." Theodore gathered the documents and returned them to the file with deliberate care. "The CEO will reveal herself when she is ready. Mr. Harrington, not when you demand it. That is not how this works. For now you have 48 hours to sign the restructuring agreement. If you do not, this file goes to the FBI by courier at 9 a.m. on Thursday." He stood and walked to the door. Then he paused and turned back. "One more thing. The CEO asked me to pass along a message. She said true wealth does not shout. It whispers. She said you would not understand what that means. She hopes that one day you will. Theodore left the room. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Julian sat alone at the mahogany table, staring at the space where the file had been, feeling the walls of his kingdom crumbling around him, while he could not even see who was swinging the hammer. He signed the restructuring agreement the next morning at 7:15 a.m. He used the same pen he had used to sign his divorce papers. He still did not know who owned Vanguard Holdings. He would find out in 2 weeks at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible place, in front of 650 of the most powerful people in New York. And it would be the kind of reveal that people talk about for decades. But first, Vivian had other battles to fight. 2 weeks after the Vanguard signing, she sat in the penthouse at the St. Regis on the 54th floor looking out over Central Park as the city prepared for the evening rush. She was 8 months pregnant now. The baby was active today, turning and kicking with a restless energy that Vivian had come to interpret as her daughter's way of saying, "I am ready, let us go." The penthouse was a study in quiet elegance. No marble desk, no imported Italian anything. Just warm wood, soft lighting, a wall of books, and a kitchen that smelled like the chamomile tea Theodore had insisted she drink every morning since the divorce. Baby clothes were folded neatly on the back of the living room chair. An ultrasound photo was pinned to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a tiny giraffe. She was on a video call with Evangeline in Newport. Evangeline Aldridge was 86 years old. She sat in a leather wingback chair in the library of the family estate overlooking Narragansett Bay, a cup of Earl Grey balanced on her knee and a shawl around her shoulders that was older than most of the furniture in Julian's office. Her white hair was swept back in a style that had not changed in 40 years, and her eyes behind gold-rimmed spectacles were the color of a winter sea and twice as sharp. She had built the Aldridge Empire, not inherited it, built it. Her late husband Vivian's grandfather had started with a single boat in Philadelphia during the Great Depression. Evangeline had turned that boat into a fleet, the fleet into a shipping line, the shipping line into a global enterprise that now controlled significant interests in maritime transport, rare earth mining, and the software infrastructure that powered half of Wall Street. She was worth $3.1 trillion. She wore a $30 shawl. She did not see the contradiction. "The board is ready." Evangeline's voice was clear and commanding despite her age. "Theodore's team has completed the audit. The question is, Vivian, what do you want, revenge or justice? I need you to be very clear with me because they are not the same thing." Vivian sat down slowly in the chair across from the screen. She rested her hands on her belly. He stole from his own employees' grandmother, their retirement fund. 81 people who showed up every day and worked hard and trusted him. Some of them are 2 years from retirement. They have no idea that the money they were counting on does not exist anymore. That is not about me. That is about them. Evangeline studied her granddaughter's face for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Good. Lead with that. When you lead with justice, the personal satisfaction takes care of itself. Your grandfather always said that." After the call ended, Vivian sat alone in the quiet apartment. The city hummed 54 floors below. The baby kicked. She placed both hands on her stomach and spoke to her daughter the way she had been speaking to her for months, quietly, honestly, as if the child could already understand. "Your daddy does not want us, Meredith. That is what I am going to call you. Meredith Catherine Aldridge, after the strongest woman I know. And I am going to make sure you never need anyone's approval to know what you are worth. Not a man's approval, not the world's approval, not even mine. You are going to know it in your bones, baby girl, because your mama learned the hard way what happens when you let someone else decide your value." She felt Meredith kick again 3 times in rapid succession like a heartbeat. Vivian wiped her eyes and picked up her phone. She called Dorothy. "Dorothy, I'm scared again." "Of what, honey?" Dorothy's voice was warm and immediate, as if she had been sitting by the phone waiting for exactly this call. "That I will enjoy it." Dorothy laughed. It was a full, rich laugh that could have melted butter at 40 paces. "Honey, if you enjoy it a little bit, that is just the Lord's sense of humor. Now go get him. But Vivian did not get the chance to go get anyone. 2 hours later, the pain hit. She was in the nursery folding tiny onesies and arranging them in the dresser drawer by color when the contraction came. It was sudden, sharp, and deep. Not in her belly, but lower, a white-hot lance of agony that made her gasp and grip the edge of the dresser so hard her knuckles went white. Theodore. She managed to get the word out barely more than a whisper, but Theodore had been in the adjacent room as he always was when Vivian was in residence, and the sound of her gasp triggered an instinct honed by decades of crisis response. He was through the door in 4 seconds. He took one look at her face, one look at the blood spreading on the cotton of her dress, and he was already on the phone. Mount Sinai Maternity Emergency. We are 8 minutes out. Have a team standing by. The next hour was a blur of sirens, sterile corridors, fluorescent lights, and the relentless beeping of machines. Vivian was rushed to the maternity ward at Mount Sinai Hospital, where a team of 3 doctors and 2 nurses surrounded her with the kind of controlled urgency that is more frightening than panic because it means the professionals are genuinely scared. Pre-eclampsia. The doctors used the word calmly, but Vivian could see the concern in their eyes. Her blood pressure was dangerously elevated. The sustained stress of the past weeks, the divorce, the restructuring, the gala that was scheduled for 2 weeks from now had taken a toll that her body could no longer absorb. The baby was at risk. Vivian lay on the hospital bed under the buzzing fluorescent lights, her hand on her belly monitors, beeping on both sides of her like a mechanical heartbeat. She was terrified in a way she had never been terrified before. Not of losing money, not of losing the company, not of Julian or Scarlett or any of the human threats that populated her waking hours. She was terrified of losing Meredith, of losing the one thing in the world that money could not buy and power could not protect. Please. She whispered it to no one and everyone, to the doctors and the nurses and the universe itself. Take everything I have, every dollar, every company, every building, every stock, every trust. Take all of it. Just save my baby. Please, just save her. Dorothy arrived 20 minutes later. She burst through the hospital room door, still wearing her flour-dusted apron from the bakery, because when the phone had rung and Theodore's voice had said the words, "Hospital and emergency," Dorothy had not even paused to take the apron off. She had run to her car, driven 11 miles over the speed limit, and talked her way past 3 nurses by sheer force of Brooklyn determination. She took Vivian's hand and held it with both of hers. "You listen to me. This little girl is an Aldridge. She held on through 6 years of that man's cruelty. She held on through tonight. She held on through everything this world has thrown at you. She is not going anywhere, Vivian. Do you hear me? She is not going anywhere." The doctor stabilized Vivian over the next 2 hours. The blood pressure came down. The bleeding stopped. Meredith's heartbeat, monitored through a device strapped to Vivian's belly, remained strong and steady, a rapid, insistent drumbeat that said, "I am here, I am not leaving." But the verdict was severe. Dr. Catherine Miles was a woman in her early 50s with kind eyes and a voice that brooked no argument. "Strict bed rest, Miss Aldridge. No travel, no stress, no leaving this hospital room for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. Your body has been under extreme sustained stress, and it has reached its limit. If we push further, we risk a premature delivery with serious complications. You need to rest. That is not a suggestion. It is a medical order." Vivian stared at the ceiling. The triumph of signing the Vanguard agreement, which had felt so total and so final just days ago, evaporated like morning fog. "I cannot run a restructuring from a hospital bed, Dorothy. The board meetings, the SEC filings, the web integration. Everything is happening in the next 2 weeks, and I am lying here connected to machines." Dorothy squeezed her hand. "Theodore can handle the business, honey. That man has been running things behind the scenes since before you were born. Your job right now is not to be a CEO. Your job right now is to grow that baby. Everything else can wait." Vivian closed her eyes. A single tear rolled down her cheek and fell onto the hospital pillow. She had won the battle with Julian. She had stood at the Four Seasons and watched Theodore dismantle him piece by piece. She had signed the papers that would give her control of his company, and his future. And now, 2 hours later, she was flat on her back in a hospital bed, unable to move, unable to fight, unable to do anything except lie still and pray that her body would hold together long enough for her daughter to arrive safely. Evangeline called from Newport. Her voice came through the speakerphone clear and strong. "Vivian, listen to me. Your grandfather built this dynasty from nothing, a single boat and a dream during the worst economic catastrophe in American history. He was told he was finished 100 times by bankers, by competitors, by the weather. Do you know what he always said? What the storm is not your enemy. Vivian, your enemy is the voice inside you that says the storm will never end." Evangeline leaned closer to the camera, though Vivian could not see her, only hear her voice through the phone. "That baby you are carrying is an Aldridge, and Aldridge women do not break. We bend, we bleed, we get knocked flat on our backs in hospital beds, but we do not break. Now stop crying. Call Theodore and fight from that bed like the general you were born to be." Vivian hung up the phone and stared at the ceiling for exactly 90 seconds. Then she pressed the call button and asked the nurse for a second pillow, a phone charger, and permission to use her laptop. The nurse, who had been instructed by Dr. Miles that Miss Aldridge was to have minimal stress, looked uncertain. "The stress of lying here doing nothing while someone destroys my company is worse than the stress of fighting back. I promise you I will not leave this bed, but I need my computer." The nurse brought the computer. Dorothy, who had been watching this exchange from the chair by the window, set down her novel and stood up. "What do you need, honey?" "I need you to go to the gift shop downstairs and buy every phone charger they have. I need you to call Theodore and tell him to get up here with a secure laptop and a pot of real coffee, not this hospital decaf." "And Dorothy?" "Yes. Thank you for being here. For all of it. Honey, I have been waiting 6 years to watch you do this. I am not going to miss it now. I will be back in 10 minutes with chargers and coffee. You start planning." Within the hour, Vivian's hospital room had been transformed into a command center. Theodore had arrived with 2 secure laptops, a mobile hotspot, 3 encrypted satellite phones, and a leather briefcase containing the complete Harrington Digital Ventures financial dossier. He set everything up on the rolling hospital tray table with the methodical precision of a man assembling a field headquarters. Dorothy had returned with 6 phone chargers, a pot of coffee she had somehow convinced the hospital cafeteria to brew at double strength, and a bag of chocolate chip cookies from her own bakery that she had stashed in her car for exactly this kind of emergency. The heart monitor beeped steadily beside the bed. The lights of Manhattan glittered beyond the hospital window. And Vivian Aldridge, 8 months pregnant, in a hospital gown with an IV line in her left arm and a laptop balanced on her belly, went to war. Her first call was to Harrison Webb. She did not beg. She did not explain. She did not appeal to his sympathy or their shared history or the fact that his family and hers had been business allies for 30 years. She simply sent him one document through a secure email link and asked him to open it. The document was the full, unredacted financial audit of Harrington Digital Ventures. But it was not just the audit of Julian's fraud, the pension embezzlement, the shell companies, the offshore accounts. Harrison had seen those numbers already. What was new was the forensic analysis of the emails Julian had shown Harrison 3 days ago, the ones that supposedly proved Vivian was erratic and unstable. Theodore's team had deconstructed the emails line by line. The timestamps were wrong. The metadata showed they had been created on a laptop registered to Scarlett Vaughn, not on Vivian's devices. The IP addresses were inconsistent. The language patterns analyzed by a linguistic forensics expert the Aldridge dynasty kept on retainer did not match Vivian's writing style. They matched Scarlett's. In short, the emails were forgeries, and the forensic proof was irrefutable. Harrison read the document in silence. When he spoke, his voice was colder than Vivian had ever heard it. "That little weasel sat in my office and lied to my face. He showed me fabricated evidence and asked me to help him steal your company. I will testify to that under oath if it comes to it. Thank you, Harrison. I am going to need that." Her second call was to the 2 board members who had flipped their votes. She did not threaten. She did not raise her voice. she presented them with a very simple reality. They had voted to suspend her proxy based on Julian's motion. Julian's motion was supported by fabricated evidence. By voting with him, they had functionally endorsed a fraudulent filing. If the SEC investigated, and the SEC would investigate, their votes would be part of the record. They would be named as co-conspirators, not because Vivian would name them, but because the evidence would. She gave them a choice. Reverse your vote by end of business today, and you will be remembered as board members who corrected an error when presented with new evidence. That is an honorable narrative. The alternative narrative is considerably less comfortable. I will let you decide which story you prefer to tell. They flipped back within 40 minutes, both of them. The proxy suspension was reversed. Vivian's voting authority was restored. Her third move was strategic rather than defensive. She instructed Theodore to leak the real restructuring financials, the accurate ones, to 3 carefully selected Wall Street analysts. Not the entire dossier. Just enough. The fact that Vanguard Holdings had injected $220 million in new capital. The fact that the employee pension fund, which Julian had gutted, had been quietly and fully restored. The fact that the Sentinel algorithm, the crown jewel of the Harrington technology portfolio, was performing 18% above projections in beta testing. The analysts published their assessments. Within hours, the stock began to recover. By the following morning, it had regained 13% of what it had lost. Dorothy brought soup. She set the thermos on the tray table next to the laptop and the encrypted phone and the stack of legal documents. You just ran a corporate war from a hospital bed in a nightgown. Your grandmother would be proud. Heck, I am proud. And I barely know what half those words mean. Vivian smiled. She closed the laptop. She leaned back against the pillows and placed both hands on her belly. Meredith was kicking 3 quick thumps in a row, the rhythm that Vivian had come to think of as her daughter's applause. We did it, baby girl. We are safe. She closed her eyes. The monitors beeped. The coffee grew cold on the tray. For the first time in days, she slept. She did not know that while she slept, Julian and Scarlett were in Julian's apartment on the Upper East Side, planning the most destructive act of their partnership. She did not know that Scarlett was pacing the living room like a predator, her mind working through angles and vulnerabilities with the focused cruelty of a woman who has decided to burn a house down because she cannot own it. She did not know that the second false victory was about to be shattered by a bomb. Not a physical bomb. Something worse. A digital one hidden inside the one piece of technology that made Harrington Digital Ventures worth anything at all, rigged to detonate in a way that would send Vivian to prison and take Meredith away from her arms before the baby ever had a chance to know her mother's face. Julian was pacing. He had been pacing for the better part of an hour, wearing a groove in the expensive Persian rug that Scarlett had insisted they buy to make the Upper East Side apartment look more sophisticated. The board had flipped back. Harrison Webb was not returning his calls. The stock was recovering. Every move he had made in the past week had been countered, neutralized, and turned against him with a precision that felt almost surgical. He was running out of moves, and he knew it. Scarlett sat on the leather sofa with her legs crossed and a glass of wine in her hand. She had been quiet for 20 minutes, which was unusual for Scarlett, and therefore dangerous. When Scarlett went quiet, it meant she was thinking. And when Scarlett was thinking, the world should be afraid. We need something bigger. She said it, finally breaking the silence like a hammer through glass. Something she cannot recover from. Something that does not just hurt her. Something that ends her. What is bigger than taking the board? Julian stopped pacing and turned to look at her. We kill the product. Julian felt the words hit him like a physical blow. He stared at her, waiting for the punchline, for the moment when she would laugh and tell him she was joking. But Scarlett's face was completely serious, her eyes cold and calculating in a way that made something deep in Julian's stomach twist. What the Sentinel algorithm? It is the only reason this company has any value. Without it, the stock is worthless. The merger is dead. Vivian loses everything. That is insane, Scarlett. That is our own company. If the algorithm crashes, I lose everything too. Scarlett set down her wine glass with deliberate care. She looked at him with an expression that contained no warmth, no affection, no pretense of partnership. Just pure surgical calculation. It is not our company, Julian. It is her company. She made that very clear. You are a figurehead, a puppet. Remember, that is what I called you on the sidewalk. And I was right. So the question is not whether we destroy the company. The question is whether we destroy it on our terms or let her bury us on hers. She walked to his laptop and opened it, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the confidence of someone who has done this before. I still have system access, my secondary admin login. Theodore's team never found it. She was wrong about that last part, but she would not learn it for several more days. Theodore Blackwell had found the backdoor access on the very first day of the restructuring audit. He had mapped every access point, every credential, every digital fingerprint in the Harrington Digital Ventures network. He had found Scarlett's secondary login within hours, and he had made a decision that would define everything that came after he did not close it. He left it open deliberately because Theodore understood something that Scarlett, for all her cunning, had never learned. The most effective trap is not a locked door. It is an open one that leads exactly where you want your prey to go. Scarlett outlined the plan while Julian stood by the window and felt the last traces of his conscience flicker like a candle in a draft. They would use her backdoor access to reach the source code repository for the Sentinel algorithm. Julian knew the architecture better than anyone. He had helped design it back when he still did actual work instead of just posing for magazine covers. He would write the logic bomb, a few dozen lines of malicious code buried deep in the subroutines that would cause the entire system to crash catastrophically once the user base exceeded 12 million. The crash would look like a technical failure, not sabotage. The stock would collapse. The merger would die. Investors would flee. But that was not the genius of the plan. That was just the detonation. The genius was the framing. Scarlett would plant false evidence using Vivian's compromised proxy credentials from the brief period when the board had suspended her access. She would make it look like Vivian herself had inserted the malicious code routing the digital fingerprints through access points that had been temporarily linked to Vivian's account during the suspension. When the bomb went off and the investigators came looking, every piece of digital evidence would point to one person, Vivian Aldridge. When this goes off, Scarlett's voice was flat and matter-of-fact, the tone of someone discussing quarterly projections rather than corporate terrorism. She does not just lose money. She goes to prison for corporate sabotage, for wire fraud, for conspiracy. And with a newborn baby child, Protective Services takes the kid. Vivian loses everything. The company, the fortune, the reputation, and the baby. Julian was staring out the window, his hands shaking, not with fear, with the toxic energy of a man standing at the edge of a cliff and looking down. The baby Scarlett. That is my daughter. She is... He could not finish the sentence. He had called Meredith an anchor. He had questioned her paternity. He had told Vivian to try not to have the baby in the Honda Civic. But somewhere beneath the layers of ego and cruelty and self-interest, a single nerve remained. Scarlett killed it. Your anchor. That is what you called her. Remember. Are you going soft on me now, Julian? Because if you are, I can walk out that door and you can wait for her to bury you. Your choice. Julian closed his eyes. He took a breath. He opened his eyes. He sat down at the laptop and began to type. He worked through the night line by line by line. The code was elegant in its malice, a masterpiece of destruction written by a man who knew the system's architecture, the way a surgeon knows the body he is about to cut open. Scarlett handled the framing with meticulous care, rerouting access logs through 3 different proxy servers, layering the false trail through Vivian's compromised credentials. When it was done, Julian pressed enter. The screen flashed confirmation. The payload was embedded. Scarlett picked up a burner phone purchased at a 7-Eleven in Midtown 2 days earlier and sent a text message to a financial crimes reporter. They toasted with champagne. Julian's hand was not steady, but the champagne helped. They believed they had won. What they did not know was that Theodore Blackwell was sitting in a security office on the 45th floor of Harrington Tower, watching every keystroke from every terminal in the building. He had been watching Julian type for 7 hours. He had watched Scarlett route the false evidence trail. He had watched them purchase the burner phone. Every line of code, every fabricated timestamp, every digital fingerprint, logged, authenticated, and stored on a secure server in Newport. Theodore picked up his phone and dialed Vivian's hospital room. It was 3 in the morning. "Miss Aldridge, I apologize for the hour, but we have a situation and a decision to make." "What happened?" "They took the bait. Both of them. Everything is on record. I left the door open and they walked through it exactly as I expected. We have everything we need to end this permanently, but the FBI will need to be involved and we will need to move quickly. There is a reporter with a tip that could complicate things if it publishes before we act." Vivian was silent for a long moment. In the background, the heart monitor beeped. "How long do we have?" 48 hours before the article goes to print. "Then we have 48 hours. Call the FBI, Theodore, and call grandmother. Tell her the Aldridge women are going to war one last time." Meredith Catherine Aldridge was born on a Tuesday. She arrived at 36 weeks, 2 weeks early, but she came screaming, which Dr. Miles said was a very good sign. She weighed 6 pounds and 3 ounces strong for her gestational age, with a full head of dark hair that Dorothy said was clearly from Vivian's side of the family. Vivian held her daughter for the first time in the quiet hours of a Tuesday morning. Meredith's face was red and squished and perfect. Her hands were impossibly small, her fingers curled into fists the size of walnuts. She had Julian's blue eyes, though Vivian would not realize this for several weeks. And she had Vivian's mouth, which Dorothy noticed immediately. "Hello, Meredith. I am your mama, and I promise you no one is ever going to make you feel invisible, not for one single day of your life. You are seen, baby girl. You are loved. And you are an Aldridge." Dorothy sat in the chair beside the bed, weeping openly and making no attempt to hide it. Theodore stood outside the door in the hallway. Through the small window, Vivian could see him turn his face toward the wall for a moment. When he turned back, his eyes were red. He replaced his glasses, straightened his tie, and resumed his post. In Newport, Evangeline listened on an open phone line. She had been connected since the labor began. When she heard Meredith's first cry, she said a single word. Magnifique then hung up and wept in her library, surrounded by books and photographs and the memory of a husband who would have given anything to see this day. For 3 days, the world was small and warm and safe. On the 3rd day, Theodore entered the St. Regis penthouse at 9 in the morning. Vivian was in the nursery feeding Meredith in a rocking chair by the window. Theodore's face told her everything before he opened his mouth. How bad? He told her about the logic bomb. He told her about the false evidence trail. He told her about the anonymous tip to the reporter and the 48-hour timeline. If the article publishes before we act, you will be implicated in a federal crime. The evidence Scarlett planted is sophisticated. It will take weeks to unravel in court. During those weeks, you could be arrested. Meredith could be placed in protective custody. Vivian held Meredith closer, feeling her daughter's heartbeat through her skin. How do we prove it was them? We already have everything. Miss Aldridge, every line of code Julian wrote was captured by our keystroke logging system. The false evidence trail was constructed on Scarlett's laptop using her secondary admin credentials, the ones I deliberately left active. We have the burner phone purchase on Julian's credit card and the 7-Eleven security footage showing his face. The case is airtight. You knew they would do this. I knew Julian's ego would not permit him to accept defeat, and I knew Scarlett was the more dangerous of the two. I left the door open, and I waited for them to walk through it. A plan is not a crime. An executed act of sabotage is. Vivian looked at Meredith. She thought about what Scarlett had said. Child Protective Services takes the kid. She thought about waking up in a jail cell and not knowing where her daughter was. Call the FBI. Call them right now. And Theodore, call grandmother. Tell her this is the last battle. We finish this today. It took Theodore less than 3 hours to deliver the complete evidence package to the FBI Cybercrimes Division at the Federal Building in Lower Manhattan. FBI agent Rachel Morrison called it the most thorough private evidence submission she had ever seen. Theodore returned to execute the final phase. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Julian received a phone call at 2 in the afternoon. "Mr. Harrington, there is an emergency board meeting at the Four Seasons at 4 p.m. The Web Capital merger timeline has accelerated, and there are technical questions about the Sentinel algorithm that only you can answer. Your expertise is critical." Julian's ego could not resist. He put on his red tie, checked his hair in the mirror, and drove to the Four Seasons. Scarlett received a separate call, a meeting with the new chief marketing officer of Vanguard Holdings, to discuss a possible reinstatement also at the Four Seasons, but on a different floor. At 4 p.m., Julian walked into the conference room on the 32nd floor. Theodore was there, standing by the window. Harrison Webb sat at the table, his face set in controlled fury. The company's chief technology officer sat at a laptop connected to a large screen, and two men in navy blue FBI windbreakers stood near the door. Julian's eyes went to the badges. FBI. The color left his face. "What is this?" "Please sit, Mr. Harrington." Julian sat because his legs would not hold him. The screen lit up. Every line of code Julian had typed over the past 7 days appeared in real-time playback. His employee ID in the corner, his terminal number, the timestamps. Line by line, the logic bomb materialized like a confession written in fire. Then security camera footage from the 7-Eleven. Julian Harrington purchasing a burner phone with his credit card. Then the metadata analysis. Every false digital fingerprint traced back to Scarlett's laptop. Julian watched his crimes play out on the screen. His hands shook so badly the table vibrated. "Vivian, please." I was angry. "The baby. I did not mean to, please." Theodore picked up his phone and placed it on the table, speakerphone on. The room heard 2 rings, then a click, then Vivian's voice. "Hello, Julian." In the background, barely audible, a baby fussed softly. Julian heard his daughter, the child he had called an anchor. She was right there on the other end of the line, and he could not touch her. "You called our baby an anchor. You tried to destroy a company employing 3,000 people. You planted evidence to frame me for a federal crime, and you would have let them take Meredith from me. You would have let strangers take our baby girl from her mother's arms so you could win." Meredith cooed. The sound cut through the conference room like a blade. "I spent 6 years loving you, Julian. I paid your student loans. I worked 2 jobs so you could take unpaid internships. I washed your clothes and cooked your meals and held your hand when you were scared. You never once asked about my family, never once asked where I came from or who my people were, because you did not care. You only cared what I looked like standing next to you." The monitors in the penthouse beeped twice. "All you had to do was be kind, Julian. That was the only test. And you failed it every single day." FBI agent Rachel Morrison stepped forward. "Julian Harrington, you are under arrest for attempted sabotage of critical financial infrastructure, fabrication of evidence, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Please stand and place your hands behind your back." The agents turned him around. The handcuffs clicked shut. As they led him toward the hallway, Julian twisted his head back. "That is my daughter. You cannot keep her from me. She is mine." Vivian's voice came through the speaker one final time. "You kept yourself from her, Julian. I just watched." 3 floors below, Scarlett Vaughn walked into a conference room expecting to meet the new chief marketing officer. 2 female FBI agents were waiting. "Scarlett Vaughn, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit corporate sabotage, fabrication of evidence, wire fraud, and unauthorized access to protected computer systems." They cuffed her. She screamed for a lawyer the entire way to the elevator. 6 months passed. At the Federal Correctional Institution in Otisville, New York, Julian Harrington woke up at 6 a.m., ate breakfast from a metal tray, and reported to the prison laundry. His hands were rough and cracked from industrial detergent. His hair was buzzed to stubble. He wore a beige jumpsuit 2 sizes too large. He had spent the first month in shock, the second in rage, the third in depression. Now at 6 months he was simply empty. On a Tuesday morning in late spring, a guard rapped a baton against the bars of his cell. "Legal visit. Move." Julian's heart lurched. A legal visit. It could be news about the appeal. It could be a miracle. He was led down the corridor in shackles. The guard deposited him in the visitation room, a bleak space divided by thick plexiglass with phones mounted on both sides. Julian sat down expecting his lawyer's tired face. Instead, he saw Vivian. She sat on the other side of the glass like a visitor from another universe. She wore a simple trench coat over a cream silk blouse. Her hair was loose. She wore no jewelry except a small gold pendant at her throat. She looked rested, healthy, radiant. She held a photograph. Julian picked up his receiver, his hand shaking violently. "Vivian, you came." "I did." Theodore advised against it. "But I owed you one last visit, one last explanation, and then I am done." She held up the photograph. Meredith at 6 months old, laughing, reaching toward the camera with chubby hands, dark hair and 2 tiny pigtails, Julian's blue eyes and Vivian's mouth. Pure, joyful happiness. She was being held by an older man with a kind, weathered face. Julian had never seen this man in his life. Julian pressed his hand against the glass eyes fixed on the photograph. "She looks like me." "She does." His eyes shifted to the man holding his daughter. Vivian did not explain. She let the silence fill the space between them. Then she reached into her bag and produced a document, a photocopy of an old legal form. "Do you recognize this?" Julian squinted. "It looks like the prenup. The one you made me sign." He said prenup with bitterness that tasted like rust. He remembered that day with excruciating clarity. He had been so proud, so arrogant. He had insisted on protecting his assets, a leased BMW, $12,000 in savings. He had made Vivian sign as a condition of marriage. He had not read the addendum. Vivian read it aloud. Should the spouse of the beneficiary remain in the marriage for a period of 8 years and demonstrate consistent loyalty, kindness, and fidelity during said period, the spouse shall be entitled to 50% of the non-vested trust dividends. Upon the 10th anniversary of the marriage, payable annually in perpetuity. Julian's mouth went dry. How much last year's dividends alone were approximately $550 million. She said it casually as a statement of fact. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. The room tilted. If you had stayed, Julian, if you had been kind, if you had just been a decent husband and a loving father, if you had said thank you when I cooked your dinner, and I love you when I held your hand, and our baby is beautiful when I told you I was pregnant, if you had done those simple, ordinary human things for 2 more years, you would have been worth $500 million. And it would have kept growing every year for the rest of your life. $550 million. The number hung in the air like a ghost. You would not have had to work another day. Everything you were so desperate for. It was all waiting for you. All of it. The only price was kindness. Julian broke. Tears he had been holding back for 6 months poured out in great racking sobs. He pressed his forehead against the plexiglass and wept. "Why did you not tell me?" "Because true wealth does not shout, Julian. It whispers. It waits to be discovered. I wanted to be loved for who I was, not for what I could buy you. I wanted a man who would look at me in a stretched sweater and see something worth keeping. And you looked at me and saw something to throw away." She folded the document and returned it to her bag. "I chose the wrong man. That is my mistake. But you chose cruelty over kindness when kindness was the only thing being asked of you. That is yours, and you will have to live with it for a very long time. Why are you telling me this?" "To torture me." Vivian stood up. She smoothed her coat. "No. I am telling you so you can stop wondering. You spent your whole life keeping score, obsessed with what you were owed, with what you deserved. Now you know exactly what the score is." She looked at him one final time. Not angry, not cold, not triumphant. The expression of a woman who has moved on. "Meredith will know who her father is when she is old enough to understand. I will not lie to her, but I will not wait for you, Julian, and I will not come back here. This is goodbye." She hung up the phone. Julian watched her walk away. Her heels clicked against the concrete floor. The sound grew fainter. Then the heavy steel door opened, swallowed her, and slammed shut. The guard did not come for 5 minutes. Julian did not move. He stared at the plexiglass, and he understood finally what he had thrown away. 1 year later, on a sunlit terrace overlooking Narragansett Bay in Newport, Rhode Island, Vivian sat in a cushioned garden chair with Meredith on her lap. Her daughter was 1 year old, babbling in the private language of babies, grabbing at everything within reach. The garden was in full bloom, explosions of color tumbling down the hillside toward the bay, which sparkled in the afternoon sun. Evangeline sat beside them, 87 years old now, a cup of Earl Grey balanced on her knee, a cashmere shawl around her shoulders. Dorothy was visiting from Brooklyn. She sat in a third chair drinking sweet tea from a mason jar, complaining that Newport pastries were overrated. Theodore stood at a respectful distance, reviewing security reports on his tablet. He allowed himself a rare, small smile. Miss Aldridge, several updates. Julian Harrington's second appeal has been denied by the Federal Circuit Court. The 8-year sentence stands. His attorney will not file a third appeal. Vivian nodded. She felt nothing. The chapter was closed. Additionally, Miss Vaughan's plea deal was rejected by the sentencing judge. She received 3 years at the Federal Women's Correctional Facility in Alderson, West Virginia. Dorothy snorted. I read she tried to sell her story to People magazine from inside, wanted to do a whole spread. Theodore permitted himself a very small smile. They declined. Their exact response was, "Who?" Dorothy threw her head back and howled with laughter. Meredith, startled, looked at Dorothy and burst into giggles. Vivian turned to Dorothy. Speaking of good news, I have been meaning to tell you something. Uh-oh. Whenever you say that, it means you have done something ridiculous and generous, and I am going to cry. I bought the building your bakery is in. The whole building. The deed has been transferred to your name. It is yours, Dorothy. Free and clear. No rent, no mortgage, no landlord. Yours. Dorothy's face cycled through 7 expressions in 3 seconds before settling on helpless, overwhelmed love. She burst into tears. You did not have to do that, honey. You held my hand when I thought I was losing Meredith. You sat with me in that hospital room for 11 days. A building is nothing compared to that, Dorothy. Nothing. Dorothy pulled her into a hug, holding on tight. Evangeline watched with eyes that glistened behind her gold-rimmed spectacles. She waited until the embrace ended, then reached out and took Vivian's hand. I am making a change to the trust, Vivian. The loyalty clause stays, but I am adding a new provision. I am calling it the Meredith Clause. Vivian looked at her grandmother. Any future spouse of any Aldridge heir must demonstrate 2 full years of consistent kindness and integrity before they are told the family name. They must love us when we look ordinary. They must prove themselves when there is nothing to gain. We will never let another Julian Harrington through the door. Vivian smiled. You think of everything, grandmother. Evangeline kissed Meredith's forehead. The baby grabbed a fistful of the old woman's shawl and gurgled. I learned from watching you. Vivian's phone buzzed. The quarterly report. Aurora Harrington Technologies had reached an all-time high. 19 million users. Revenue growth of 32%. A partnership with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. 3,000 employees with secure jobs and fully funded retirement accounts. She did not open the report. The numbers would still be there tomorrow. Meredith grabbed a daisy from the garden. She held it up to Vivian with a drooly, gap-toothed grin, offering it with the serious generosity of a child who believes that a flower is the most valuable thing in the world. And she was right. Vivian took the daisy. She held it in one hand and held her daughter in the other. She looked at Dorothy, wiping her eyes with a bakery napkin. She looked at Evangeline, feeding Meredith pieces of soft bread with patient hands. She looked at Theodore, pretending to read his tablet, but actually watching them with the expression of a man who has spent his entire career protecting a family and has finally seen the reason why. 3 generations of Aldridge women sitting in the sun surrounded by flowers. Unbreakable. You, my love. Vivian whispered to Meredith, pressing her lips to her daughter's dark hair. You are the only fortune that ever mattered. The bay sparkled. The garden bloomed. Meredith laughed.